Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis and author of the weekly Central Asia and Focus newsletter. Uzbek President Shavkat Mirziyoev has many times encouraged journalists to report on shortcomings and corruption in the government and has even promised to, quote, stand behind them, unquote, while they do the reporting. The reality is different. There are still taboo topics, particularly when reporting about corrupt practices of certain state officials. Uzbek authorities quickly reined in traditional media when reporting hit areas that were uncomfortable for the government, but non-traditional media, bloggers and vloggers, remained for a short time beyond the state's attention. That has changed now also, and bloggers in particular are receiving some of the harshest punishments for crossing the invisible line between what is and is not permissible to report about. On this Majlis podcast, we look at the situation with media, both traditional and non-traditional, in Uzbekistan. To discuss all this, I am joined by Umida Niyazova, director at the Germany-based Uzbek Forum for Human Rights, and Steve Swerdlow, a rights lawyer who has spent many years focusing on Central Asia and is currently an associate professor of practice of human rights at the University of Southern California. Thank you both for joining me. And Steve, I'd like to start with you. There's been some developments in terms of bloggers, some good, some bad. Can you kind of fill us in on what's happening?
Well, mostly bad. And, I guess you could say there are some small silver linings. There's been a number of really troubling prosecutions of bloggers and imprisonment of bloggers over the past several years, and the pace seems to be picking up. We've seen the blogger Abdul Qadir Muminov sentenced to 7 years and 3 months in prison back in August. And then more recently, the blogger Olimjon Haydarov, a very popular voice in Fergana, being given a lengthy prison sentence. And this is on top of this trend that maybe began a little bit earlier, but began, or at least most notably, with the imprisonment of Atobek Satori, another blogger who got a very stiff, I believe, 6.5-year sentence. Now, with Atobek Satori, we did see a development that I think it's not a coincidence that this seemed to coincide with Human Rights Day in Uzbekistan, December 10th, well, not in the world. And he was not released, even though the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention at the United Nations has clearly called his sentence unlawful and called for his immediate release. But he was transferred to, in Uzbekistan, what's called an open prison colony or a colony settlement. This is a less strict prison regime where you're able to leave the prison during the day for work, and your life is a little bit easier. But make no mistake, it's still imprisonment, and it still contradicts the calls of the international community. And then there's another development in the field of religious freedom and blogging. There was one very notable release, which was the blogger Fozil Khoja Arif Khojayev, who blogged about religious issues in addition to others. And there were calls coming for his release, most notably from the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom and other human rights organizations, I believe also Umida's. And so there's been a lot of activity, at least. But the overall trends, including the legislative trends in Uzbekistan for some time, have been extremely worrying when it comes to freedom of expression. So that's a little bit of the update.
Okay, thank you. Umida, can you talk a little bit about bloggers too? I know that your organization released a detailed report several months ago about this. Did they kind of escape notice from the government at first when Mirziyoyev was saying, go ahead and report on this. It's important that we know what's not happening that needs to happen. Did he forget about the bloggers? And now the government's finally realizing that actually there's a lot of problems with the reporting they're doing?
Right. So we published the report in June this year. The president's broken promises puts journalists and Uzbek bloggers at risk. So over 2 years ago, the situation with bloggers began to noticeably deteriorate, and sadly, there are no signs the situation will improve soon. And as a subscriber to many popular and not so popular Telegram channels run by Uzbek bloggers, I would like to note peculiarity of the Uzbek blogosphere. So bloggers in Uzbekistan, especially those living in the regions, are perceived and can be considered as civil society activists because they are blogging about issues of social importance, whether it's energy prices or shortages, corruption of local officials, workers who don't receive their wages. And the bloggers I'm familiar with have similar to human rights activists. Like earlier, when the internet was not so developed in Uzbekistan, we called such people like citizen reporter or human rights activists. And now these bloggers have their Telegram or YouTube channels with tens of thousands of subscribers, and now their voices are louder than the voices of people in their communities who are not being heard. And people who turn to these bloggers and ask them to report about their problems. So they also see bloggers as defenders of their rights. And these bloggers have very different background, often with no knowledge of journalism or journalistic standards, but they fulfill this very important role that normally the media would fulfill in democratic societies. So they are watchdogs for the actions of the authorities. And I also wanted to, as the case of Otabek Satari, who was recently transferred to the open prison, it is remarkable that he was sentenced to such a long term because, like Olimjon Haydarov, he was accused of extortion on a large scale, and he allegedly extorted 2 apartments from the Hakim of Termes. And the same Hakim, who was in November last year, he was sent to prison himself for corruption. And the Supreme Court finally ruled that these apartments, which had been confiscated previously, should be returned to Otabek's family, but his sentence was left unchanged. So the charges against him were very dubious from the beginning, and the verdict was disproportionately harsh, and he's still in jail, even if he was transferred to the open prison.
So Satari was actually correct in his reporting, and he was sentenced, and they didn't change the sentence, even though it was later uncovered that the officials really were corrupt.
Oh yes, absolutely. So the same mayor of Termes, who was sent to I think 9 years in prison for embezzlement and corruption, he witnessed at the trial of Otabek, telling that Otabek extorted the money from him. And the mayor was sent to prison. The Supreme Court returned the flat to Otabek's family, but surprisingly, this harsh, 6.5 years in prison charge was not changed. And what is telling about this is the political order to silence the critical blogger.
Can I just chime in for a second, Bruce?
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
Just wanted to second something that Umida was saying, which I think is really profound for us to just pause and consider for a moment, which is these are the human rights activists of today's era, although, of course, we also have a category of other human rights defenders in the country. But it's so striking to me, and I'm sure to Umida even more so, since she was in this community when based in Uzbekistan, that the extortion and the bribery charges that we see being leveled against Haydarov, against Satari, these same charges, these were the charges that after the Andijan massacre were rolled out again and again and again against the human rights defenders all over the country, like Azam Farmonov and others, from Jizak to Tashkent to the Valley. You had this very typical pattern. And unfortunately, it seems in the past 2 years, as Umida was saying, this string of charges, which are really, I think, lazy charges that in these closed trials, for example, I believe Muminov's trial was closed. The bar is so low. It's so easy for the prosecution to get away with murder. and there's so little we understand about how the investigations unfold in these cases. There was another case that lesser light has been shed on it, but very disturbing, where Khurshid Daliyev, the chief editor of Human.uz, and another two journalists that work with him were also imprisoned on corruption, ostensibly for bribery and running a Telegram channel where they were alleged to be blackmailing people in exchange for positive coverage. But those investigations after they're arrested, they're remarkably closed, and there's no transparency. We don't quite know, but we have reason to believe that there could be ill treatment or torture. And then we get, as Umida was saying, really disproportionately long sentences: 6 years, 6.5 years, 7 years, 8 years. And all of this really leads to the conclusion that there's something deeply wrong going on here. And again, I just wanted to pause and at the beginning of the program and say that this looks awfully similar to the darkest years, like 2006 and 7 and 8. After Andijan, when we saw, and even 2005 included, where we saw this kind of string of muzzling the messenger.
And
Yeah, that's, go ahead, Umida.
Yes, thanks. I want to add on extortion charges. You know what? Unlike journalists who can be influenced or censored, right, or can be fired, the advantage the bloggers have is their independence. And this is both their strength but also weakness. So the weakness is that they don't have an editorial office behind them, they don't have a regular salary, and they have no team to help to research the issues they're working on. And even up until April, I think 2021, bloggers were at least able to earn something from advertising on YouTube. But as I know now, monetization function on YouTube is not working in Uzbekistan. And what has developed in the Uzbek blogosphere is the practice of accepting a fee from people in exchange for reporting on their problems. And I'm not saying this is some kind of crime, of course not. But it could be problematic because it poses a conflict of interest, at the same time, it's often the only means the bloggers have of earning a living. And as we see, so we have seen several cases where the authorities have been able to frame this exchange of kind of services and goods as fraud or corruption, so resulting in the arrest of the most critical and popular Uzbek bloggers. So, and Olimjon Haydarov's case, like he was sent again, so his 8 years prison term, it is because of this large-scale extortion. And Olimjon is known for criticizing the local authorities, the mayor of Kakan, and previously had been fined for publications, including for covering gas shortage problems. Last winter, we reported about his case. So we can discuss ethical issues, whether a blogger can kind of simultaneously criticize officials and also charge them for positive coverage of their activities. But such a harsh sentence of 8 years imprisonment, I think, speaks volumes about the political background of this case. And because this was not a violent crime, and he claimed he returned the money he had received as payment for advertising the market.
I think Umida just hit on a very important aspect of this, Bruce, which is that the category of blogger is somehow, we're in this period where right now there's so much activity around this, so many arrests. I think the international community, to some extent, or the diplomatic community, is struggling a bit to respond to the Uzbek argument, the Uzbek government arguments. And we can see recently the Agency for Mass Information and Communications put out a statement in response to a request from Voice of America about the conviction, the 8-year sentence, I guess, for Haydarov, which was so tough and disproportionately long. And they basically said, well, the law is the same for everyone. you expect us to go easy on this group of people. They're ordinary citizens. The law is the law. Sort of, we're putting our foot down response. And sometimes it's hard to respond to that argument. As Umida said, that it's a weakness that the bloggers are accused of accepting money in return for activities, which can be construed as bribery. But I think that also leads to this very key concern, which is that it would be very possible for the authorities to enforce this area of the law through civil suits, through fines, and more importantly, through education, training, support. And that's in fact what many other bloggers are still even now courageous enough to speak out in response to these convictions. And they're calling for there to be some better approach to this. But I think what we shouldn't take at face value is the response from the government that it's necessary to arrest someone and put them in pretrial detention for months before trial for a nonviolent crime, or for the allegation of a nonviolent crime. So I think that's where we need to hone in and really focus the advocacy efforts, is in making sure that bloggers and really the context of chilling freedom of speech in Uzbekistan is taken into account, and there are other methods used rather than arrest and taking custody of someone for this kind of nonviolent action.
Well, let me ask either one of you: do they have laws about what exactly bloggers are subject to in Tajikistan, for instance? You have to pay tax on any money that you're making from your YouTube channel or something like that. Is that true in Uzbekistan? Do you know?
I know that many bloggers, they register their small LLCs like MCZ, and they do pay taxes. Like I know, like some even my friends who are doing like video blogging, and they accept money from people who apply to them, and they pay taxes. But again, this when we are talking about these public activists and human rights activists, this can be easily used against them. So that's why I was always, I think that it's very important for international community, for funds, different foundations, to support this kind of public activism, to support Uzbek bloggers as they support human rights groups.
Okay, thanks. So there's still kind of some gray area as to whether bloggers are a business or a media or what. But in any case, Steve, I want to get back to this one point of the government seems to be trying to set an example of these people, right? You've mentioned that the punishment seems incredibly harsh for this. I mean, we've seen reports coming out of Uzbekistan for violent crimes where people are only sentenced to 3 or 4 years, but these bloggers, 6, 7, 8 years in prison. You think the government, now that they found out that the potential bloggers have for uncovering bad corruption, things like that in the state, that they're kind of going down the same road you'd mentioned on Dijon. They're going down the same road they used with media years ago of harsh punishment to bring people into self-censorship.
Yeah. I think you made a connection right now that is really interesting and important. And of course, it's absolutely shameful, and I think especially angering to the feminists and the activists that have been working on domestic violence legislation, pointing our attention to how these light sentences for really violent offenders, perpetrators of abuse, shamelessly short, right? And not strict or harsh enough. And then that's contrasted with this phenomenon, which you pointed out. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about how these convictions in some ways are the cousins or the relatives of the same types of extremism and or terrorism convictions that we've seen for years against individuals accused of being extremists simply for practicing their religious beliefs, absent any evidence or any credible allegations of an involvement in violence or an incitement even to violence. So, in some ways, this is the core problem with governance and with not just politics, but with the way the government operates in Uzbekistan, which is that it absolutely not only censors, but punishes thoughts, alternative ideologies, criticism very broadly construed. And so this shouldn't surprise us because many of the reforms that the human rights community has been calling for since President Mirziyoev took office in 2016 have been left unfulfilled when it comes to these core issues, both in the realm of religious freedom extremism, calls for overthrowing the constitutional order, for example, and then in this area of the media sphere. And I think it's really important at this point in the conversation to recall what President Mirziyoev has said, because he's really personally staked his reputation on this segment, this category of civil society. He said, and I think you had an excerpt from this before, Bruce, but I'll just say a little bit in a little bit greater detail. In 2021, I believe, during a visit to Fergana, he was speaking with journalists, and he says, "You are my comrades in arms. I count on your help. I see you as a force that fairly tells about our achievements and our shortcomings to our people. I want to ask you one thing. Do not be lazy in your striving for answers. Don't be afraid to deliver information fairly. The president is behind you. Those days are over. We will not deviate from this path. Justice, justice, justice. Only truth." And it goes on. But, that is something that President Mirziyoev has absolutely staked his entire reform agenda on. And therefore, I think it's very much appropriate for all international actors, everyone engaging with Uzbekistan, including the United States and the European Union, to put these recent convictions to the office, to the desk of the president, and say, what is your response? Will you hold a press conference where you clarify where the line is between criticism and corruption, free speech, and what is impermissible? Will you clarify at least? Will you take responsibility for this area? So I think that's what's coming. I think inevitably, the more these convictions accumulate, and the more we see this criminalizing of bloggers, inevitably, I think it's pushing Uzbekistan back into a box that it will need to get out of.
Okay, thank you. And a reminder, we're talking about the situation with media and particularly bloggers in Uzbekistan. And my guests are Steve Swerdlow, a rights lawyer who has spent many years focusing on Central Asia and is currently an associate professor of the practice of human rights at the University of Southern California, and Umida Niyazova, director at the Germany-based Uzbek Forum for Human Rights. Umida, your comments on what Steve just said.
Yes, I remember Otabek Satari staying in the room during the trial and kind of addressing his speech to president and saying that I trust your words, and you said that president is behind me. That's why I reported and about the problems in my community. So, and he's not the only blogger or activist who actually, I think that they really believed that the activity will be protected. But I think that now when we can see that dozens of bloggers, they announce that they are closing their channels and they're not going to be involved in this activism. I think that people realized and they see that the words, the just empty words, is not enough to protect bloggers or activists, especially if they live in remote areas. And the Uzbek journalists and bloggers, they have always been aware of restrictions and the practice of censorship on certain topics. Like it's absolute taboo, for instance, to criticize the president himself or members of his family, and no one does it. But unfortunately, we see that the limit of what is permitted seem to be shrinking. And so we had been telling about these harsh sentences, and this is because the role of these convictions is to intimidate people. So that's why the sentences are so harsh.
Thanks. Steve, and I'll ask you the same question, Umida, but Steve, is there a watershed moment, a point that you can think of where all of a sudden Mirziyoev had been saying that he was all for freedom of media, supporting journalists and everything, and when did that change, do you think? Or why did it change?
That's a really good question. And, I've often tried to chart the trajectory of reforms or human rights improvements or lack of improvements over the past few years. The dam breakage and the corruption around that and the public outcry about the corruption that led to that. And Umida, I think, did a special reportage on this, in fact, and can speak to it. But, when I look at the pace and the speed of the changes, let's not even necessarily call them reforms. In Uzbekistan, obviously, we've had, and Umida knows this best, the dismantling or at least the changing and the reduction significantly of forced labor and child labor. We had the releases of political prisoners back in 2016 and into 2017, 2018. And then this, right? This area of freedom of expression and the appearance of lots of dynamism in the sphere, a lot of new sites and organizations like Kun Uz, Dario Uz, Kalampur Uz, and the list goes on. But I think, to my mind, 2018, so that's quite a while ago now. So not quite COVID, but a little before, when we started to see the government stepping back, slowing down, not necessarily embracing that pace of change that was really exciting, I have to say, exhilarating, and was so important in 2017 and part of 2018. But as we got into the COVID period, a lot of the governments in Central Asia backslid on their human rights record. A lot of them, sort of fully adopted or took on the instinct to tamp down criticism. Obviously, it was a period of an intense test of the government's ability to deliver goods and services, and there was a lot of discontent. And we saw a lot of civic initiatives from the new civil society, the young civil society of Uzbekistan, sort of being, representing a challenge to the government's narrative around COVID. And I think bloggers also were part of that. And so I see, anytime you have a major corruption scandal, that's a big, big point for the government to have a reflex like this. Another one, of course, is what we're about to do now, which is enter winter, or we're already in winter. I think every winter is a huge test for the government. There's often a lot of problems related to gas and heating, which has caused people to protest. Again, pretty modest protests. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention probably the biggest development of all of this last period, which of course is June, July 2022, the Karakalpakstan protests, the clampdown on the internet, the state of emergency, the excessive force used and the aftermath of those events. Although they're somewhat specialized or related, specifically to Karakalpakstan, it was obviously a watershed moment and opened up, I think, also a lot of tendencies that we didn't want to see in terms of trials that looked orchestrated, lengthy prison terms for Davlet Tajimuratov and others. And I think those trends taken together with what we've seen in the area of freedom of expression, combined with the constitutional referendum and the president standing for a third unconstitutional term, I think all of that together is showing us that it's time to really take stock. It's time to put together an agenda and a discussion about human rights, which is more realistic and in line with, as Umida has been saying, these disturbing trends over the past few years.
Okay, thanks. Umida, what's the moment or the moments that you remember where the government started backtracking on all these great statements and promises about opening everything up to the media?
Yeah, I think it happened over 2 and maybe even 3 years ago, when we, from the very beginning, there was a time, maybe 2 years time, when Mirziyoyev came to the government, when there was a single human rights activist or political, not religious, but the activists who had been sent to prison for being a member of political party like ERK or Berlik. So there was a time like no journalist or activist had been in prison. I'm not talking about religious activists. Yeah, religious prisoners. And I think over 3 years ago, the government started to arrest people for expressing their views. And maybe over a year ago, the censorship in the big media like Gazeta Uz or Kunuz is becoming more visible, and especially I think it happened just a few months during the last months when the journalists announced that they're leaving Gazeta Uz and Kunuz. And I spoke with one journalist who worked at Gazeta Uz, and which is considered to be a very liberal publication. But he said that he's leaving because of increasing censorship. And we can also remember the case of Ilyos Safarov, the brightest journalist who recently left Kunuz. And I saw that it sparked a lot of discussion in social media about the Uzbek mass media state. And he also wrote that the Uzbek journalism is entering a very difficult and complex period. And before I forget, Bruce, I would like to share one interesting case with the censorship at Kunuz.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'd like to share one interesting case which was close to my organization, like Uzbek Forum, and it was regarding the censorship at Kunuz. And in March this year, Tashkent, so economist from Tashkent, Yuli Yusupov, he wrote an article in Kunuz. So the article was about the coercion and forced labor in Uzbekistan's silk sector. And so he wrote about inefficient management of this sector, about the farmers who are forced to grow silkworm cocoons. And he referenced the monitoring data of Uzbek Forum as a source. And then the Silk Association, which unites the Uzbekistan silk production and processing enterprises, they claimed that the article damaged their business reputation, and they filed a lawsuit with the court demanding an apology from Yusupov. So in August, the court of the first instance, they ruled that Yusupov should apologize for publication at the same media, like where the article was published, so in Kunuz. So Yuli, he appealed this decision, and just recently the court overturned the verdict of the first court. And Yuli has no longer to apologize for writing this. But I'm saying this, that this topic is directly related to Kunuz, because the original article was published in Kunuz. But to my surprise, Kunuz decided not to cover the trial. So despite the fact that it was directly related to the publication in Kunuz. And it's clearly a kind of censorship problem. And you know what, this kind of censorship works invisible. I'm sure we don't know of many other cases because it's invisible for external kind of actors. So because if an article is stopped by the editor and never published, so we will never know about it.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're getting close to the end of time, so I'm going to give you both a chance to make some last comments. But I'm curious, do you think is what's happening now? You've both been covering Uzbekistan for a long time. Is it starting to remind you of some of the darker days of the Karimov era as far as media, or do you think there's still a chance that we're headed in at least a different direction than what we've seen before when Karimov was in power? Umida, I'll start with you.
So it's not clear how long this status quo will remain, or whether the situation with freedom of expression will continue to deteriorate. But we can already count dozens of bloggers and activists, unfortunately, who have said that they're stopping their activism, and because it's becoming too dangerous. And what is particularly frustrating is the kind of immense resources Uzbek government is investing in its public image of Uzbekistan as a new, dynamic, free, democratic country. This is how we would like to see our country, but it simply doesn't reflect the truth. And important that Uzbek government gets the message that they can't kind of have it all ways, like a liberal economy without civil liberties. Rule of law is one of the most important indicators for investors. But if it's becoming increasingly difficult to expose corruption because bloggers are being silenced and media censored, who is the guardian of the rule of law? And I think this should be the question for the international investors, for the business, and organizations like European Union and others.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Leave the last word with you. How does this compare with the situation now compare with the Karimov era, in your opinion?
God, it's such it's difficult to compare because I think, especially the youth in Uzbekistan, are really clamoring for change and for more responsiveness on the part of their government. And as I was saying, I think, 2016, 2017, 2018 really did help burst open the door for a more dynamic media culture. Although these arrests, they really truly, as Umida was just illustrating so well, they've left to these really leading figures in the blogging community and the journalistic community to just altogether leave the profession. And I think that should worry us because obviously, and it may be a cliche, but the way a government treats journalists, critics, bloggers is a bellwether for the overall human rights situation. They are the canary in the coal mine. I wrote a report in 2018 about the media situation in Uzbekistan. It was called "You Can't See Them, but They're Always There." And this was a quote from a media organization, a journalist who was saying that, even though things had changed, they could still see the influence and feel the pressure of the security services who were still monitoring every publication. And yet I have to say, Bruce, I open up the pages of Gazeta Uz sometimes, and their reporting is just it's so encouraging, so inspiring. We did see, media organizations like Hook, very small ones, reporting on Karakalpakstan. And the truth is that it adds so much value to our understanding that I think the diplomatic community, the international community, has to understand that without support for journalists at this critical time, we're going to lose so much valuable insight into the really interesting processes underway in Uzbekistan. So yes, you can have all the investment you want, you can have businesses coming, but if you don't have the rule of law and a vibrant media community, there's really going to be major problems. And this has ripple effects. Another small case to mention at the end here is the documentary center run by our friend Timur Karpov, 139 Documentary Center, which, by the way, the number 139 is connected to the charge in the criminal code for defamation, which Timur's mother, the leading journalist and photographer, photojournalist and artist, Umida Niyazova, was convicted on during the Karimov period. And sort of in honor of that dark period, this art center took the name, very playfully, of this dark aspect of the Karimov period and said, we're moving forward. We're using our sense of humor to overcome the darkness, overcome the Karimov legacy. And yet they are now embattled. They've been told they have to vacate their premises and may have to find a new location. And it doesn't appear that that's ready to happen. So we're following that case steadily, and we're going to be supporting them as much as we can. But I think it's definitely a time, and this podcast is so timely, to really rally together and call for bloggers in particular to be supported, for there to be engagement on this issue, to view these cases as politically motivated in many cases. And so I share Umida's concern, but I do think that we're not exactly where we were, obviously, in the Karimov period, but it's worrying, it's troubling, and it's time to work together to improve the situation in Uzbekistan.
Remember, Steve, when we talk about Karimov time, we always remember about the gravest times. But we had been discussing with Bruce before you joined us. The Karimov time was not always the same. There was a time when Ozot League and Freedom House and Human Rights Watch, they had offices registered in Tashkent and worked from there, and we didn't see this under Mirziyoyev's times. So it was not yeah.
Oh, that's true. That is different.
That's absolutely right. And I think Umida and others have pointed out that, there was, in a way, a high point of civil society development between 1999 and 2001, or, up until maybe 2003, perhaps. It varies. But I think that's absolutely right, that we shouldn't wait for things to descend to where they were in the darkest period of Islam Karimov to act.
Okay. Thank you. We do have to go. So once again, thank you, Umida and Steve. And a big thank you to Nathan Shoemaker, our Majlis podcast producer in Washington, D.C. And a reminder, you can subscribe to the Majlis podcast or the Central Asia in Focus newsletter by visiting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website at rfarl.org. Thanks, and we'll be back next week.